And my answer to that is the Ottomans didn't need to cross the Atlantic. They were a major world power that had an enormous amount of territory. They didn't need to cross the Atlantic. Crossing the Atlantic was obviously a mistake by Columbus in the first instance, but a move born of desperation.
Welcome to Unraveling the Middle East. I'm Adel Ali, your host. Please join me and my guest, Dr. Ali Mikhail, in this two-part episode as we unravel the Middle East. Dr. Mikhail, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. I want to speak with you about Sultan Selim I. But before we do that, would you please tell us a bit about the Ottomans?
Sure. Thanks for having me on the program. The Ottoman Empire is one of the most consequential states in world history. They are the longest lasting empire in Islamic history, one of the largest land-based empires in world history, stretching across 3 continents, lasting for 600 years. Some 33 or more countries, depending on how you count, were either directly ruled by the Ottomans or very much in their orbit.
You mean 33 countries in our modern time would fall into their territory?
That's right, okay. Right. And multiple global world processes that most people consider to be important for the making of the modern world have some connection to Ottoman history, and I'm sure we'll get into some of that in the conversation today. The Ottomans are important in thinking about the history of Islam because they have one of the largest source bases from any quote-unquote Muslim empire that ever existed.
Source bases, you mean primary sources for research purposes?
That's right. So scholars who are interested in something like Islamic law or the Islamic jurisprudence or ideas of rulership in the Muslim world, whatever topic it is people are interested in, we have more sources that remain from the Ottoman Empire than we do from any other Muslim state in history. So,
oh wow, what a treasure trove for research.
Yes, it means that Ottoman history is quite rich. There are many more sources than there are historians to work on them. And it means that historians who are interested in Islam outside of the Ottoman Empire can often find answers to some of the questions they're looking for in Ottoman source material, in the Ottoman archives. So
also, if I may add, perhaps some European historians that want to know about, let's say, the Austro-Hungarians or Russians can find source material from
absolutely
from
historians of Iran, historians of parts of sub-Saharan Africa, even historians of places as far away as South Asia can find source material in the Ottoman archive. So they're quite a rich repository. So, you know, for professional historians, the Ottomans are quite important. And I think for people who are not professional historians, I think they might be surprised to learn how relevant the Ottomans are to things they might not consider to be connected to them.
Yeah, I'm very excited to talk about their relevance to world history in their own time, our time, and much else. And before we go there, I'm going to ask you a question that itself could be a podcast. I'm just curious here. We can keep this brief because I appreciate this is a broad question. The Ottomans were not indigenous to the Middle East, to Anatolia, right? I mean, by the time it becomes an empire, they've been there several hundred years. Am I close to the mark here?
Yeah, that's a very complicated question.
I appreciate that. Yeah.
So I think you're referring to a phenomenon of the migration of Turkic peoples.
Thank you. Yes.
From parts of Central Asia. Historians debate where exactly, and they pick people up along the way. People settled along the way, but eventually a group of Turkic peoples who had not lived in Anatolia for hundreds of years did arrive in Anatolia, and some of those people did become early members of what we might call the Ottoman state. But it's a highly complicated process. There's a lot of intermarriage. There's a lot of intermingling with local communities all along the way. In Anatolia itself is a highly variegated, culturally mixed place of Greeks, Armenians, Persians, Arabs, etc.
So when you say Ottoman, it's not just the Turks; it includes a wider groups of people.
That is a very important point to stress. Is that the Ottoman Empire does not belong to the modern Republic of Turkey. The Ottoman Empire is a much more complicated and wider state than simply a Turkish empire.
Yeah.
At certain points in its history, again, 600 years of history. So we're talking about a very wide expanse of time. At certain points, the majority of the people who lived in the empire were Christians. At certain points, it was, and in certain places in the empire, it's much more Greek than it is Turkish. At other points in time and in other places, it's much more Arab. In the Balkans, obviously, there's a very different ethnic milieu. So
yeah,
Slavic, when we're talking about the Ottoman Empire, we're really talking about many, many different kinds of
no, to my credit, I shared the disclaimer that this is a very broad question, but you shed quite a bit of light on who sort of they basically are. What do you think was some of the big impacts of the Ottoman Empire? I have some ideas, for example, age of exploration, the Atlantic world, and some of these that you've researched yourself.
Okay, well, again, that's a very broad question. The book that we're talking about is really centered on the life and times of one particular Sultan, Selim I. So it's a 50-year period, his life from 1470 to 1520. So if we take just those 50 years, again, in a 600-year empire, there are many world-shaping events that happen during those 50 years. The age of exploration being one of them, which we might, to be more precise, think about both in terms of the Atlantic world, so the crossing of the Atlantic by Columbus in 1492, Vasco da Gama into the Indian Ocean. That is generally, you know, when people discuss the age of exploration, those are some of the world events that they are thinking of. So if we just take that, I'm very interested in the book in thinking about how the Ottomans push west in the Mediterranean, which occurs during Selim's lifetime. And maybe we'll get into that in more detail.
We'll get into Selim. Yeah. Go ahead.
But that push west in the Mediterranean is at the expense of many European powers, but one of them is Spain.
And we're talking about late 1400s, the first half of 1500s, right?
Right. Okay. So Selim's life, again, is 1470 to 1520, but if you like, we can think about it from 1450 to 1550.
Okay.
So I'm very interested in the book in the ways that Ottoman-Spanish rivalry in the Mediterranean impacted, for example, Spanish colonization in the Caribbean. So there's a very curious thing when you read the sources of Spanish colonization in what becomes today we call the Caribbean and Mexico. They use the language of Islam in very strange ways. Columbus referred to Taino women, the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, of parts of the Caribbean. He describes their dress as Moorish.
Moorish.
Cortés, in the conquest of what becomes Mexico, describes Montezuma as a sultan. He refers to Aztec structures as mosques. So this is something that requires explanation. And one of the ways of explaining it in the book that I address is that these men, Columbus, Cortés, many of these conquistadors, are forged in a world in which Christianity and Islam are fighting for power in the Mediterranean, to put it very crudely. So Cortés fights in North Africa before going to the Caribbean and actually fights the last battle of his life in Algiers. Columbus, born in Genoa, is very much steeped in a crusader world. Genoa was a very important crusading port.
Yeah.
He's born around the time of the conquest of Constantinople, which is very impactful for European Christians. And some of the early voyages that he takes in the Mediterranean actually bring him in close contact with the Ottomans and North African powers. And so I'm interested in the ways in which that this early experience of, again, to put it crudely, fighting against Islam in the Mediterranean shapes this world-changing event, I think we can all agree, of Europe's colonization of the Americas. And that's not generally a story that we hear, that Islam, the Ottomans, North African Muslim powers had any role to play in the conquest of the Americas. And I'm not obviously arguing that, Muslims crossed the Atlantic and fought with the Spanish. There are actually some indications that that there were some, but
Or somewhat.
Well, in some of the early voyages in the Americas, there are instances of Muslim slaves being involved in colonial ventures.
Oh, I see.
Right. So there are instances of actual, if you like, living, breathing Muslims involved in the colonization of the Americas. And that is to say nothing of the highly important phenomenon of enslaved Muslims from West Africa being taken to the Americas to work on early Spanish plantations in the Caribbean. Yeah. That's a story I get into in the book in another place. But just to finish the thought is, when I'm speaking about Columbus and Cortés, I'm really talking about their mental landscapes, right? I'm talking about the figuration of Muslims in their minds as affecting their actions on the ground in the Caribbean.
Couple observations. One is that if a European empire wants to increase its commerce, back then a lot of commerce were through Asia. One of the obstacles, geopolitical obstacles for them, was the Ottoman Empire, this behemoth sitting there. So in a way, that sort of incentivized them to look for elsewhere. And so hence that partially explains the age of exploration. But I want to go back to several little anecdotes that you shared about language. Islam language used in the Caribbean. Montezuma was called the Sultan. Their temples will call it the mosque. Women wore, quote unquote, Moorish dresses. It almost seems like, going back to what you were saying mentally, the Spanish and European mental landscape, the Ottoman Empire wasn't just a military power. It also affected the way they think of the world. Kind of like, let's say, in Finland or in Turkey now, they may use words that they learn from the United States because the United States is the big player in the world. You see what I mean? That sort of seems like that the Ottoman really was, I don't want to say a cultural movement, but it was more than just a military presence.
That's absolutely true. That is absolutely true. So
one follow-up question, Dr. Mikhail. Again, this could be beyond the scope of what I originally contacted you about. Are there any evidence in your specific research anyway, that you came across that the Ottomans ever thought, hey, maybe we should go to this new world? I mean, they had their hands so full of everything they already had and the lands they had conquered. Is there anything about that? Because in the West, we think of exploration as a sexy thing, right? We think of, but that may not even have been their cultural and sort of mental background.
So if we're talking about the Atlantic world in specific, the Indian Ocean world is a different story. There is no evidence that I found of any real indication that the Ottomans had any desire to attempt an Atlantic crossing. And we might ask, well, why is that? Precisely as you were suggesting, But this is a sign of power, of ingenuity, of something like that. And my answer to that is the Ottomans didn't need to cross the Atlantic.
Exactly.
They had territory from Algeria all the way around the Mediterranean to the Balkans, stretching into Iraq after Selim's period. They had footholds on the Red Sea and therefore the Indian Ocean. They were a major world power that had an enormous amount of territory. They didn't need to cross the Atlantic. Crossing the Atlantic was obviously a mistake by Columbus in the first instance, but a move born of desperation, right?
Exactly.
There's the economic story that you mentioned and some of the other military things that I was talking about. So it's not the genius of the West or Columbus or anything like that that is useful in thinking about, even if those things ever even existed. It's not useful for us to think in those terms,
Exactly. Yeah.
but rather to kind of think geostrategically and geopolitically.
And when you say Columbus's crossing of the Atlantic was a mistake, what you mean is that he accidentally happened upon, quote unquote, the New World. Yeah.
Of course.
Let's take a break here. In the next segment, we'll talk about something that we've mentioned several times, Sultan Selim I, God's shadow. We'll be right back. Did you know that the Ottomans didn't use the printing press until the 18th century? How about this one? Did you know that in the year 1450, real wages were much higher in Istanbul than they were in London, Antwerp, or the Netherlands? But by 1750, standards of living, including real wages, were higher in Western Europe, such as in Paris or Leipzig, Germany. And did you know that tax collection was a major issue for the Ottoman Empire, which put them at a huge disadvantage vis-a-vis their European rivals, such as the Austrian Empire? In my conversation with Dr. Philip T. Hoffman, a professor of economics and history at Caltech, I asked him, how did the small European kingdoms defeat the huge empires of Asia, including the Ottomans? I also asked him this, how did the Middle East fall behind Europe? Of course, my question begs this question. What does it mean to fall behind? I've dropped a link for you to my conversation with Dr. Hoffman in the detailed caption of this video. And please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and to share our program with friends. And thank you for both. Now, let's get back to our conversation with Dr. Mikhail about the Ottomans and the Age of Exploration. Dr. Mikhail, in the last segment, we mentioned Sultan Selim I several times. First, who was he and what was his impact? Why did you choose to research him specifically?
Right. So, all the questions you were asking me before about Age of Exploration and the power of the Ottomans, it's really born during Selim's reign. So he is
which was very brief, like 8 to 10 years or something.
8 years he's on the throne. The centerpiece of that power is the largest geographical expansion of the empire in its 600-year history. Wow. Selim is the one who undertakes that with his conquest in parts of eastern Anatolia, in what is today eastern Turkey, and then more so his defeat of the Mamluk Empire, which was another very important Muslim empire whose capital was in Cairo. So that expansion makes the empire go from being an empire with its capital in Constantinople and territory in the Balkans and the western half of Anatolia to an empire that rules all of the Middle East, most of North Africa, parts of the Arabian Peninsula, and then parts of, what is today the Caucasus, northwestern Iran.
That's huge real estate. Holy.
It's a huge expansion, more than doubling the size of the empire, and giving the empire basically the shape that it will have. It will add some territory, lose some territory, but basically the shape it will have for the next 400 years until its demise in World War I. So this is to my mind, the most important moment in Ottoman history, and deserves our attention, as historians in my case, and I think as a general educated public. So that's essentially the main reason I wanted to focus on his life.
This is fascinating. For people that are non-experts, when we usually think of the well-known sultans of the Ottomans, we think of who, like, for example, Suleiman the Magnificent, right? But based on what you're saying, Selim I was even more magnificent. This is huge territory. So this is interesting. As you're telling me, the expansion is occurring in North Africa and what we call Middle East, the other parts of the Middle East, in Eastern Anatolia and Iran and Mesopotamia. This sort of makes the Ottomans the big government, the big ruler in the world of Islam. This sort of changes. They go from ruling Western Anatolia and the Balkans, and now they become an Islamic empire. Is that fair to say?
Right. It depends what we mean by Islamic Empire.
Yeah.
They become the custodians of the holy cities.
Mecca and Medina.
Yes. This is a moment in which the demographics of the empire radically shift from being a majority Christian empire for 200 years to beginning to be a majority Muslim population for the first time in its history. This is when the sultans begin to take on a much more Islamic ethos in terms of their rhetoric, if you like, inheriting the custodianship of the holy cities is an important piece of that. And yes, this changes the character of the empire in a really fundamental way.
Was it their mission to become the inheritor of the Islamic Empire, the Islamic world, or was it just geopolitics to go, here's another kingdom, let's go conquer them?
I mean, I'm more on the latter. So I think empires conquer. All empires want territory, no matter what religion ostensibly they belong to. It's not the Ottomans, just like the Spanish, just like the Mughals were attempting to conquer territory.
Yeah. So when you say they take on more Islamic rhetoric and they become the guardians of Islam, especially Sunni Islam, that begins to develop after this conquest has taken place.
Yes, there's a process that historians like to refer to as confessionalization.
Confessionalization, okay.
Okay, which is a notion that in this period, in the 16th century, again, historians argue about when exactly and where, that politics and religion begin to have a different relationship to one another and come to be fused in ways that we haven't seen before.
In the Ottoman Empire in particular, or around the world?
More globally. So people talk about, to put it very basically, the notion that the Ottomans are a Sunni empire and that the Safavids are a Shi'i empire, or that the Spanish are a Catholic empire, right? These are ideas that historians draw out from this period because of these kinds of things that I'm talking about, the ways that rulers begin to use the language of religion to talk about their rulership, to talk about their states. And these things come to be used against one another, right? So the idea that the Ottomans are defending Sunniism against the Safavids of Iran, right?
Yeah, or Shia,
yeah, or that they're going after, and Selim does this. He goes after Shi'i populations in his state, in Anatolia, right? So this idea that suddenly religious identity was always important, but comes to be fused much more closely to the politics of states.
Clarify for me again this term, confessionalization. What specifically does that mean in what you just explained? I get how politics and religion become fused after that conquest. The same you can say about Catholics or the Reformation. But what does that term specifically mean, please?
Right. So the 16th century is a moment in which Christendom is dealing with the Reformation, right? Yeah. And the rise of Protestantism.
Yes.
And so states in Europe therefore begin to take on the character of being a Protestant state or being a Catholic state, much in the same way that in the Middle East we have, the Safavids as a Shi'i empire and the Ottomans as a Sunni empire. These are all very crude markers, and of course there are Catholics in Protestant lands and Protestants in Catholic lands and Sunnis in Shi'i lands, et cetera, et cetera. But that these states now, part of their rulership is in some ways the defense or acting in the name of these confessions.
There we go. Okay.
Right. Of these religious denominations, if you like. I don't think that's the right term. But that becomes very important for understanding the politics of this period. That's what
I got it. So these confessions, I understand that. Before we leave this segment, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about Sultan Selim I himself, his life. Is there anything you want to share with us about him, the person?
Yeah, I mean, he's unique in several ways in Ottoman history. So a couple of them are he was not a favored son.
Not a favored son. Okay.
He was his father's fourth son. The one of the four died. But the least favorite of the remaining three who are vying for the throne, their father's throne. He is stationed very far away from the capital city, probably the furthest you could be from the capital city in this period, which is a disadvantage in the race to take over the throne.
It's like being in a remote office and not in his headquarters.
Yes. He has a very close relationship with his mother, who's a very important person in his life. And
was his mother Christian or Muslim?
Well, I mean, as with all of the mothers of the princes in the Ottoman Empire, she was originally a Christian woman, most likely from Albania, but we're not sure exactly, who was brought to the harem, converted to Islam. And once she had one son with the Sultan, no longer had sexual relations with him and comes to be the kind of patron of her son. This is a very classic Ottoman model. And so they go to Trabzon, this faraway city on the Black Sea, and together sort of plot his return to the capital to take over the throne. He is a very violent person. You see this in Trabzon. You see this once he's Sultan, right? He spends most of his short reign, as you said, 8 years in war. He battles in Chaldiran, very famous battle in 1514.
Is that with the Persians?
Against the rising Safavids. He marches to Cairo against the Mamluks. He undertakes a series of domestic purges of his own population that he considers to be enemies. So he's a very violent person. He's very driven, as best we can tell from his life. And yeah, he was a person who dispatched his father when his father was an inconvenient presence in his life, which is something that sometimes happened in Ottoman history, but was quite rare.
The term dispatch is not a euphemism for killing. He just sent him away.
So I use that because it's not clear whether or not he killed him or So the story is that, once he takes over the throne, he sort of sends his father off for a quiet retirement in a village in Greece. And on the road, he dies. His father dies.
And we don't know how he died.
Some people say he died of a broken heart. Some people say he was poisoned. Some people say Selim had him killed in one way or another. So the evidence is not clear. But he clearly wanted to have him leave the stage.
I see. In the next segment of our conversation, we'll talk about the Ottomans' impact on our world.